Most people believe the future changes through sudden collapse, a war, a catastrophe, a dramatic event that forces everyone to wake up at the same time. But what if that belief is wrong? What if the real danger isn't that the world ends suddenly, but that it changes so gradually, so quietly that most people never realize they're already living in a different reality? Right now, millions of people are planning their lives as if the next 20 years will look more or less like the last 20. They're saving for futures that assume continuity. They're educating their children for systems that feel permanent. They're trusting structures that have existed their entire lives. And yet, beneath the surface, something is accelerating. Not one crisis, many moving together. Ecological instability, technological acceleration, psychological fragmentation, social polarization. Individually, each looks manageable. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns are never random. There is a strange dissonance happening right now. A widening gap between how people think the future will unfold and how it is actually beginning to move. Time feels different. Systems that once felt predictable now behave erratically. The ground beneath modern life feels subtly less stable, even if most people can't articulate why. This isn't panic. It's perception. Because when you step back far enough, when you stop looking at isolated headlines and start observing the rhythm beneath them, a disturbing question emerges. What if we are already past the point where things quietly return to normal? What if what's happening now isn't a temporary disruption, but the early phase of a transition that cannot be reversed? Nearly a century ago, one man described this exact kind of moment. He didn't predict a sudden or divine punishment. He described a threshold, a period when multiple systems would begin shifting simultaneously, creating the illusion of chaos while something deeper reorganized beneath it. He marked the mid-2020s as the moment when that shift would stop being theoretical. Not the end of something, the beginning. That man was Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet. Cayce delivered more than 14,000 recorded readings between 1901 and 1945, while in a self-induced trance state. His work covered everything from physical healing and psychology to ancient civilizations and the long-term future of humanity. For decades, researchers struggled to categorize him. Mystic, medical, intuitive, religious thinker, or something else entirely. But among all his material, there is a consistent thread that becomes increasingly unsettling when viewed from where we are now. Cayce spoke repeatedly about what he called the changes. Not an event, not a single catastrophe, the changes. He described a long process unfolding over generations during which the Earth itself would begin responding to humanity's accumulated choices. He spoke of shifts in climate, geology, and magnetism, not necessarily as sudden disasters, but as destabilizations, feedback loops, systems losing equilibrium. Most strikingly, he suggested that these changes would accelerate as humanity approached a new stage of collective consciousness. According to Cayce, the Earth is not a passive object. It is a living system. And like any living system, it responds to pressure. But the pressure he described wasn't only industrial or environmental. It was psychological, emotional, conscious. He believed that humanity's collective mental state, fear, aggression, greed, disconnection, created an energetic imbalance that eventually had to resolve itself. Not through judgment but through adjustment. In that framework, instability is not punishment, it's correction. From a modern perspective, this idea sounds unscientific. But consider what we now understand about complex systems. When enough stress accumulates inside any tightly coupled system, ecological, technological, or social, it doesn't collapse immediately. It becomes unpredictable, volatile, sensitive to small disturbances. That's exactly what we're seeing. The Earth's magnetic North Pole has been accelerating its movement over the last 2 decades, faster than at any point in recorded history. Scientists have documented it carefully, noting potential consequences for navigation systems, satellite alignment, animal migration, and even electrical infrastructure. It's not dramatic enough to dominate headlines yet, but it is unprecedented. Weather systems once relatively stable now behave erratically. Rain falls where it never did. Drought appears where water was once reliable. Storms intensify in regions not built to withstand them. Farmers who have worked the same land for generations increasingly say the seasons no longer follow familiar rules. These are not ideological observations. They are experiential ones. And alongside the physical instability, something else is happening. People feel disoriented. Time feels compressed. Attention feels fragmented. Reality feels less solid than it used to. Cayce spoke about this too, though in different language. He suggested that as external systems destabilize, internal systems would mirror that disruption. He described a psychological sorting, not a moral judgment, but a divergence. Some people, he said, would respond by clinging harder to old structures, authority, identity, control, certainty. Others would begin to awaken, not suddenly, but gradually, to a deeper awareness of interconnectedness. This isn't metaphorical. You can see it everywhere. Societies are polarizing, not just politically, but perceptually. People interpret the same events through entirely different realities. It's no longer just disagreement. It's as though people are inhabiting different worlds. Some experience the present as collapse. Others experience it as emergence. Both are true. Because threshold moments don't arrive cleanly, they arrive as overlap. The old world doesn't disappear before the new one begins. They coexist, creating confusion, anxiety, and cognitive dissonance. Cayce referred to this as the breaking up of old conditions. Not just governments or institutions, but assumptions, invisible agreements, the frameworks people rely on without realizing they rely on them. He suggested the earliest cracks would appear not at the centers of power, but at the edges, in systems people take for granted. Supply chains, information coherence, trust in institutions, the reliability of technology. When those begin to wobble, people feel it long before they understand it. And that's the most unsettling part of this moment. Not that something dramatic is coming, but that the ground is already shifting. While most people continue making plans as if it isn't, they're building lives for a world that may not exist in the same form much longer, training children for systems already dissolving, investing identity and structures that require stability to survive. When that realization arrives, and it always does, the psychological impact is profound. But Cayce never framed this as a tragedy. He framed it as a birth. He believed humanity was moving from one stage of consciousness into another. A transition that would require letting go of old forms of identity, power, and separation. Birth is never comfortable. It involves pressure, constriction, a kind of death of what came before. But what follows, he said, would be a world where intuition is no longer dismissed, where empathy becomes essential, where people remember their relationship to each other and to the earth. He associated this transition with what many traditions call the Age of Aquarius, not as a sudden era change, but as a gradual emergence through crisis and revelation. We can already see signs of this. More people are leaving dense urban centers seeking land, community, and self-sufficiency. More people are questioning systems they were taught to trust. Not out of paranoia, but out of recognition. Medicine, education, media, governance. Not because all are corrupt, but because none were designed for long-term human flourishing. They were designed for efficiency, growth, and control. At the same time, more people are turning inward, exploring meditation, consciousness studies, ancient wisdom traditions, and alternative models of healing. These are not fringe movements anymore. They are adaptive responses to instability. Reality itself is becoming the teacher. Cayce also spoke about specific markers, geological activity, shifting coastlines, seismic changes. Some of his predictions remain unfulfilled. Some may never occur literally as described. But again, the importance isn't precision, it's pattern. What he consistently pointed toward was acceleration. And this is where 2026 becomes significant. Cayce identified it not as an endpoint, but as a point of irreversibility, a moment when the processes already underway become undeniable, when pretending that everything will simply return to how it was become psychologically impossible. Not because of one event, but because of accumulation. From that point forward, he suggested humanity would be forced to choose consciously or unconsciously between adaptation and resistance, expansion or contraction, fear or awareness. The future, he insisted, was never fixed. Earth changes, he believed, are part of natural cycles. But how humanity experiences them depends on collective consciousness. The more people operate from fear and separation, the harsher the transition feels. The more people operate from awareness and connection, the more navigable it becomes. This isn't about believing, Edgar Cayce. It's about recognizing patterns. If you feel that something has already begun, if the world feels subtly unfamiliar, if the pace of change feels unsustainable, then the question isn't whether it's real. The question is what you do with that awareness. Cayce said, "Those alive during this transition carry a responsibility not to save the world, not to convince anyone, but to hold a frequency to remain calm amid instability, to respond consciously rather than reactively." Because if consciousness shapes reality, as modern psychology, neuroscience, and physics increasingly suggest, then every internal shift matters. Every moment of presence, every choice of connection over fear, every refusal to collapse inward. The changes are not coming, they're here. 2026 is not a deadline. It's a marker. What emerges on the other side depends on how many people recognize the threshold while they're standing in it. What do you feel has already begun?